Welcome to the seventh session of Disruptive Innovation Novice to Expert. The cash management story for Citibank in India will continue. In the last session, which was session 6, we'll do a brief recap. We covered the importance of field work or joining the Juta Ghisao school. And we talked a little bit about how developing any missing links might be quite important, like how we had to develop courier services. And our daily control report, which we had covered in an earlier session, is now becoming more complex. And we are using the daily control report to identify the trouble spots and eliminate them, and also identify good things and amplify them. So with that, let's move on to this session, where what we are going to cover is the importance of a product Bible. Some call it a product manual. But here is what we found, that initially, when we were a very small team, then it was very easy for us to go and sell, to handle the operations, to handle this fire, that fire, etc. But as we grew, now we were going to get new people into the team. Maybe we had 30 people, 40 people. Maybe we'd end up with 100, 200 people. So how are we going to communicate everything that we learned so that others could learn it, they could have the same passion, they could have the same belief, they could understand what this business was all about. So for that, we needed a product Bible as to why we were doing this, what we were doing, how we were doing it, and what was our target market. Because clearly people would come in and say, oh, I know this company, this has a cash management problem. Why don't we sell to them? So we had to tell them, no, listen, there is a risk issue. We only want to touch the top 300 companies. And then there was a very important thing of how do you sell? Now we had picked up our experience, and so this was the days well before PowerPoint presentations, laptops, and things like that. So we had actually developed some slides. These were taken on Kodak. There was a slide projector, which we used to kind of make a presentation. And this took a hypothetical company with sales of 50 crores and showed how our product would help that hypothetical company. And then what we found was that in the sales process, if we got the okay to go and study the actual operations of the company, how they were handling their cash management today, if we could get that, then we could give them a proposal, which was basically an offer that they could not refuse. So our whole aim was that and the person we are talking to normally is a very senior person, maybe even the CFO of the company. And normally they are not bothered about these small little things like cash management. And, they are more interested in arranging lines of credit for them. They're interested in dollar loans. They may be interested in mergers and acquisitions. So this cash management is a very small thing according to them, but actually it does have a very large impact on their company if they get it correct. So how do you convince a CFO in a 20, 30-minute meeting that they should go ahead? So we had thought through this whole process very well, and we actually used this. And then later on, much later, for another product that we launched, we figured out that this whole thing of carrying a slide projector, then we couldn't have that many slide projectors. Our sales force was growing, the number of slides. So we then moved on to a method of using flip charts. And so on and so forth. So we kept innovating on how exactly are we going to sell and how are we going to move forward. Then we had to also have a pretty strong process of which deals would we refuse. Because if you end up with a set of bad customers or customers who have unrealistic expectations, they can cause you a lot of pain. So what we realized in that process, the way we had it at that time, was that the check size that the customer had was a very important determinant for us. So if you had very few dealers and you had relatively high check sizes that you were receiving, then our cost of processing compared, because remember our revenue was based on your sales. So, but our costs were based on how large your check size was. So if you are a company that sold 100 crores but had very, very small checks, then we'd have to process so many more checks. But if you were a company which sold very little, with large checks, that is, you had large distributors, large wholesalers, then it was a different ballgame. So we basically said that, our whole break even for check size is, I think it was 20,000 rupees or something like that. So if the check was higher than 20,000 rupees, you could go ahead with the deal. But if the average check size was lower than 20,000, it would require my approval before you could go ahead with the deal. So we actually did refuse certain deals because the check size was very low and it would have created a problem for us. Then we also had a very, very clear handoff process. So we wanted our salespeople to go and spend a lot of time on sales. And once they actually landed a deal, then we wanted them to pass it on to the implementation team, which would handhold the customer till it was passed on to the operations team. So we had a process where it went through sales, then implementation, and then into operations. And this was very good in terms of being able to delight the customer. So there were very specific units which handled sales, implementation, and operations. Then we had a very curious constraint that we had to deal with because we were a multinational company. So our head office would have headcount constraints. So we could not hire people on our permanent roles, and our headcount was constrained. So we had to hire contract people on contract. And the rules at that time were that a contract person could work for 90 days and then had to have 90 days where they didn't work. And then we could rehire them for another 90 days. So we would have very, very high attrition. So this was an interesting and a challenging problem to deal with, because what we ended up doing was we ended up breaking up our jobs into those which required very little training but were necessary. And so it was things like accepting checks, sending them and clearing, doing various other things which were necessary. Now what we had to do was, when we hired these contract people, we needed to interview them like in 10 minutes to see whether we thought they would fit the bill or not. And then we would have a 2-hour on-the-job training. So if it looked like the person was doing something okay, someone experienced would sit with them and help them along for about 2 hours, and we'd see how they did and whether their grasp was okay or not. And then we would break for lunch, and then after they came back from lunch, they would be on their own, and we'd see how they'd perform on their own for the next couple of hours. And if it looked like they would make it, then they would return the next day. Otherwise, they were told, thank you very much, but we don't think this job is right for you. And we would pay them for a day, and that was the end of the story. So this just goes to show you how you have to think about how you will deal with constraints which may be imposed by your internal organization, by external authorities, etc., and still end up growing your business. That's all for this session. Thank you for listening to me.